In the rugged terrain of Colorado Territory, where the Rocky Mountains kissed the endless sky and wild mustangs ran free across untamed valleys, there lived legends that spoke of impossible challenges and the men who dared to face them. Some tales whispered of gold strikes that made paupers into kings overnight. Others spoke of outlaws who could outdraw lightning itself. But perhaps no story captured the imagination quite like that of Thunder, the magnificent black stallion, who had never known the touch of rope or saddle, and the wealthy rancher's daughter who dared any man to try. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Carter was not your typical frontier woman. Beautiful as a mountain sunrise with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes that sparkled like morning frost, she possessed a spirit as wild and untamable as the horses her father raised on Sunset Valley Ranch, when 20 of the finest horsemen in 3 territories had tried and failed to break the legendary stallion Thunder. When pride and fortunes had been lost in the dust of the breaking corral, it was Emma who made a declaration that would echo across the frontier for generations to come. Standing before a crowd of defeated cowboys, her chin raised in defiance of convention, she proclaimed words that would change everything for one unlikely hero. The year was 1875, and the Colorado Territory was still young, still raw with possibility and danger. Pine Ridge Valley stretched like an emerald carpet between towering mountain peaks, its grasslands perfect for raising the finest horses west of the Mississippi. Samuel Carter had built his empire here, transforming Sunset Valley Ranch into the most prosperous spread in the territory. But it was his daughter Emma who had inherited his keen eye for horseflesh and his stubborn determination to see the impossible become reality. Thunder had appeared 3 summers prior, materializing from the wild country beyond Devil's Canyon like something conjured from the dreams of ancient spirits. Standing 17 hands high with a coat black as midnight and a mane that flowed like liquid shadow, he moved with the grace of wind-given form and the power of a mountain storm. No man had ever gotten closer than 50 yards to the magnificent beast, for Thunder possessed an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, anticipating every trap, every strategy, every attempt to capture him. The stallion had become more than just a horse in the minds of the people of Copper Creek. He represented the untamed spirit of the frontier itself, the wild freedom that civilization had not yet managed to cage. Stories grew around him like wildflowers after spring rain. Some claimed he could leap canyons 20 feet wide. Others swore they had seen him outrun Apache war ponies across the high desert. Old Pete Johnson, who had broken horses for the cavalry during the war, insisted that Thunder was no ordinary Mustang but rather the offspring of Spanish conquistador horses mixed with the legendary war mounts of the Plains Indians. It was at the annual Copper Creek Rodeo that Emma Carter made her fateful announcement. 20 of the most skilled horsemen in the territory had gathered to attempt what many considered impossible. Professional bronc riders from as far away as Texas cavalry, officers trained in the finest military traditions, and local ranch hands who had grown up in the saddle all threw their hats into the ring. The prize was substantial. Samuel Carter had offered $500 in gold to any man who could not only capture Thunder but ride him for a full minute without being thrown. One by one, they tried. One by one, they failed. Brad Morrison, the arrogant son of a neighboring ranch owner, had been the first to attempt the challenge. Morrison was everything that frontier society admired in a young man. Tall and handsome with perfectly groomed mustaches and expensive leather chaps that bore silver concos. He rode the finest quarter horses money could buy and had never met a bronc he couldn't handle. His confidence was absolute as he approached the breaking corral, where Thunder had finally been driven after 3 days of elaborate planning and 24 riders working in coordination. Morrison's failure was spectacular and immediate. Thunder, seeming to read the man's intentions before Morrison had even entered the corral, reared to his full magnificent height, and struck out with hooves that whistled through the air like war clubs. Morrison barely escaped with his dignity intact, his expensive hat trampled into the dust and his silver concos scattered across the corral like fallen stars. The Garrett brothers came next, 3 professional horsebreakers from Wyoming who had earned their reputation taming the wildest mustangs on the northern plains. Danny, Mike, and Rick Garrett moved with the coordinated precision of men who had worked together for years, employing techniques learned from Mexican vaqueros and refined through countless battles with untamed horses. They brought specialized equipment, intricate rope work, and strategies that had never failed them before. Thunder destroyed their carefully laid plans in minutes. The stallion seemed to anticipate their every move, turning their own ropes against them, using the corral's confines to his advantage rather than allowing himself to be trapped by them. When the dust settled, the Garrett brothers were nursing bruised bodies and wounded pride while Thunder stood in the center of the corral, sides heaving but eyes bright with what could only be described as amusement. Colonel William Hayes arrived from Fort Collins with military precision and cavalry discipline. A veteran of frontier campaigns who had trained horses for the United States Army, Hayes brought with him techniques developed through years of breaking wild horses for military service. His methods were scientific, systematic, and had proven successful with even the most difficult animals. Hayes studied Thunder for hours before making his attempt, taking notes, observing patterns, developing what he called a comprehensive psychological approach to equine management. Thunder's response to military precision was to demonstrate that some spirits could not be broken by discipline alone. The stallion's intelligence seemed to match the colonel's tactical mind, countering every strategic move with instinctive brilliance. Hayes found himself outmaneuvered by an opponent who fought not with learned techniques, but with the raw cunning of the wild places where civilization held no sway. As the failures mounted, the crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle began to murmur about the impossibility of the task. Thunder was not merely a horse, they whispered, but something more, something that belonged to the realm of legend rather than reality. It was then, as the 20th challenger limped away from the corral in defeat, that Emma Carter climbed onto the fence rail and made her declaration heard across the valley. Her voice carried clearly in the mountain air, each word dropping into the assembled crowd like stones cast into still water. She had watched these men, these supposedly skilled horsemen, approach Thunder with arrogance and conventional wisdom. They had tried to impose their will upon a creature that had never known submission, to apply techniques designed for ordinary horses to an animal that was clearly extraordinary. Emma's challenge was simple in its wording, but profound in its implications. She would consider marriage to any man who could accomplish what 20 skilled cowboys had failed to achieve. The words sent ripples of excitement through the crowd, for Emma Carter was not only the most beautiful woman in 3 counties, but also the sole heir to the largest ranch in the territory. Marriage to Emma would mean more than just winning a bride. It would mean inheriting an empire of grass and cattle, of horses and unlimited potential. But there was something in Emma's eyes as she spoke, a glint that suggested her challenge was motivated by more than simple amusement or the desire to find a husband. She was testing something deeper, searching for a man who could see beyond the obvious, who could understand that some victories required humility rather than force, patience rather than aggression. The crowd began to disperse as evening shadows lengthened across Pine Ridge Valley, the defeated challengers nursing their wounds and their pride. Most believed the challenge would remain unanswered, that Thunder would continue to run free and Emma Carter would remain unmarried. But fate, as it often does in the high country where legends are born, had other plans. It was just after sunset, when the mountains were painted purple against the evening sky and the first stars were beginning to appear, that a solitary figure approached the Carter ranch on foot. Jake Miller had been in Copper Creek for less than a week, working odd jobs. For meals and a place to sleep in the loft above Rodriguez's livery stable. He was a quiet man in his late 20s, lean and weathered from years of hard work, with calloused hands and clothes that had seen better seasons. Jake's arrival in Copper Creek had been unremarkable. He had appeared one morning leading a tired horse that bore the marks of many miles, asking Ben Rodriguez for work in exchange for feed and shelter for his mount. Ben, who had a good eye for judging men, had noticed something about the stranger, a way of moving around horses that suggested deep experience. But Jake kept his past to himself and asked no questions of others. Unlike the previous challengers, Jake brought no expensive equipment, no team of assistants, no reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. He approached the Carter Ranch with nothing more than a worn rope coiled over his shoulder and a quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from some deep, still place within him. The few ranch hands who saw him walking up the dusty road in the gathering darkness thought perhaps he was lost, seeking directions to somewhere else. Samuel Carter was on his porch, smoking his evening pipe and contemplating the day's failures. When Jake appeared at his front gate, the older man studied the stranger with the shrewd eyes of someone who had built an empire through careful judgment of character. Jake's clothes marked him as a working man, possibly a drifter, certainly not someone with the resources to compete with the wealthy ranchers and professional horsemen who had tried and failed. Emma appeared beside her father as Jake removed his hat and addressed them both with simple courtesy. His voice was quiet but carried easily in the still evening air, and there was something in his manner that commanded attention despite his humble appearance. He had heard about the challenge, he explained, and if the offer still stood, he would like to try his hand with Thunder. Samuel Carter's first instinct was to dismiss the request. The day had seen enough failure, enough men convinced of their own abilities humbled by an untamable force of nature. But something in Jake's quiet confidence, perhaps the absence of the bluster and boasting that had characterized the other challengers, made him pause. Emma, too, found herself studying this unexpected visitor with newfound interest. There was something different about Jake Miller, something that set him apart from the parade of skilled horsemen who had tried and failed. Where others had approached Thunder with the mindset of conquerors seeking to impose their will, Jake seemed to regard the challenge as something else entirely. When he spoke of the magnificent stallion, there was respect in his voice, not the frustration or anger that had marked the words of the defeated challengers. Old Pete Johnson emerged from the shadows near the barn, having heard the conversation from where he'd been tending to the injuries of the day's failures. Pete studied Jake with the experienced eye of a man who had spent 50 years around horses and the men who rode them. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something in the stranger's bearing caught Pete's attention, a familiar quality that stirred memories of other horsemen he had known, men who possessed that rare combination of skill and understanding that separated true horse whisperers from mere riders. The challenge was accepted as the last light faded from the western sky. Jake would make his attempt at first light, when Thunder was typically brought from his holding pen to the breaking corral for his morning water. Samuel Carter found himself curious about this quiet stranger who approached an impossible task with such calm assurance, while Emma discovered that she was looking forward to tomorrow's attempt with an anticipation she had not felt during the day's earlier failures. As Jake settled into the barn loft for the night, declining the offer of a room in the ranch house, he spent time with Thunder's presence just beyond the corral fence. The stallion, magnificent and alert even in the darkness, seemed to sense something different about this latest challenger. Where Thunder had shown only aggressive wariness toward the other men, he displayed a calm watchfulness toward Jake, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood the language of patience and respect. The morning of Jake Miller's attempt dawned clear and crisp, with frost painting the grass silver and the first rays of sunlight turning the mountain peaks golden. Word had spread through Copper Creek despite the early hour, and a small crowd had gathered at the Carter Ranch to witness what many expected would be another failure. But there was something different in the air that morning, a sense of anticipation that had been absent during the previous day's attempts. Jake approached the breaking corral with the same quiet confidence he had displayed the evening before. He carried no specialized equipment, no complex rigging or elaborate ropes. Instead, he bore only a single length of braided rawhide and a manner so calm it seemed to affect even the restless energy that typically surrounded Thunder's presence. The magnificent stallion stood in the center of the corral, his black coat gleaming in the morning light, his intelligent eyes fixed on this latest challenger, with what appeared to be curiosity rather than hostility. Emma Carter watched from the fence rail, finding herself inexplicably drawn to observe every detail of Jake's approach. Where the previous challengers had entered the corral with aggressive confidence, making immediate moves to establish dominance, Jake simply stood at the gate for several long minutes, studying Thunder with the patient attention of a man reading a complex book. There was no hurry in his movements, no sense of urgency or frustration that had marked the efforts of more experienced horsemen. Samuel Carter found himself equally intrigued by the stranger's methods. In his years of raising horses, he had observed hundreds of attempts to break difficult animals, and Jake's approach was unlike anything he had witnessed. The man seemed to be engaging in some form of silent communication with Thunder, a conversation conducted entirely through posture, patience, and presence rather than force or technique. Old Pete Johnson, positioned near the fence where he could observe both horse and man, felt a stirring of recognition that transported him back to his younger days when he had learned horse handling from an old Comanche warrior who had been captured. During the Indian Wars, the warrior had possessed an understanding of horses that transcended mere technique, treating each animal as an individual spirit, requiring respect rather than submission. Jake's bearing reminded Pete of that long-dead teacher, suggesting depths of knowledge that extended far beyond conventional horsebreaking. Thunder himself seemed affected by Jake's presence in ways that had not been evident with the previous challengers. The stallion's typical restless energy had been replaced by an alert stillness, his magnificent head raised and ears forward as if listening to sounds only he could hear. The aggressive posturing that had characterized his interactions with other men was notably absent, replaced by a watchful curiosity that suggested Thunder sensed something different about this latest human to enter his domain. The crowd that had gathered to witness the attempt grew restless as minutes passed without action. They had come expecting another spectacular failure, another demonstration of Thunder's untamable nature, but instead they were witnessing something entirely unexpected. Jake remained motionless just inside the corral gate, his attention focused entirely on Thunder, while the stallion regarded him with equal intensity. It was as if man and horse were engaged in a conversation that required no words, a negotiation conducted in the ancient language of respect and understanding. Mary Thompson, who had closed her general store early to witness the attempt, whispered to her neighbor that perhaps the young man was afraid to approach the magnificent beast. But Doc Harris, who had been observing Jake's demeanor with the trained eye of someone who understood human nature, recognized something different in the stranger's stillness. This was not the paralysis of fear, but rather the patience of someone who understood that some victories could not be rushed. Some challenges required time and respect rather than force and determination. Sheriff Tom Wilson, who had positioned himself near the corral fence in case medical attention became necessary, found himself studying Jake with growing interest. The man's bearing reminded Wilson of certain individuals he had encountered during his years in law enforcement, people who possessed an unusual combination of quiet competence and deep understanding of their chosen field. There was something about Jake's approach that suggested extensive experience with difficult situations, though the nature of that experience remained mysterious. Ben Rodriguez, who had provided Jake with shelter and work during his brief stay in Copper Creek, watched the proceedings with particular interest. He had observed Jake's interactions with the horses in his livery stable and had noticed an unusual quality in the man's approach to equine handling. Horses that were typically skittish around strangers had shown remarkable calm in Jake's presence, responding to his quiet authority with a trust that usually required weeks to develop. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, Jake finally began to move. His first steps were slow and deliberate, each movement designed to communicate peaceful intentions to the watching stallion. Thunder's ears remained forward, his posture alert but not aggressive, as Jake approached with the unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world. The contrast with the previous day's attempts was stark, for where other men had entered the corral with the aggressive energy of conquerors, Jake moved with the respectful demeanor of a guest requesting permission to share space with a magnificent host. The rawhide rope remained coiled in Jake's left hand, seemingly forgotten as he concentrated entirely on establishing some form of connection with Thunder. His approach was neither direct nor circuitous, but rather followed a pattern that seemed to respect the stallion's need for space while gradually closing the distance between them. It was a dance of sorts, a careful negotiation between two beings who understood that trust could not be demanded, but only offered and accepted. Emma found herself holding her breath as Jake came within 20 feet of Thunder, closer than any of the previous challengers had managed before being driven back by the stallion's aggressive response. But Thunder showed no signs of the hostility that had characterized his previous encounters with would-be tamers. Instead, the magnificent horse seemed almost relaxed, his attention focused on Jake with an intensity that suggested curiosity rather than wariness. The crowd had grown completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the usually vocal Brad Morrison, whose own spectacular failure the previous day had left him nursing both physical and emotional wounds, found himself watching Jake's approach with grudging fascination. There was something almost hypnotic about the quiet stranger's methods, a quality that seemed to affect not just Thunder, but everyone observing the proceedings. Jake's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still morning air. His words were addressed to Thunder in a tone so gentle it seemed more like a lullaby than the commands typically used by horse breakers. He spoke of the morning's beauty, of the freedom Thunder had known in the wild places beyond Devil's Canyon, of the respect he felt for such a magnificent creature. His words held no promises of dominance or submission, no threats or demands, only acknowledgement of Thunder's nobility and a quiet request for the honor of sharing space with such a remarkable being. Thunder's response was unlike anything the assembled crowd had witnessed during the previous day's attempts. The stallion took a step forward, then another, his movements as deliberate and careful as Jake's had been. The distance between man and horse continued to close, but it seemed to be happening through mutual agreement, rather than human determination overcoming animal resistance. It was as if Thunder was choosing to approach Jake rather than being compelled to submit to another's will. When Jake finally reached Thunder's side, the moment felt inevitable rather than surprising. His hand moved slowly to touch the stallion's neck, and Thunder's acceptance of that touch seemed to ripple through the watching crowd like a physical force. Here was the moment that 20 skilled horsemen had failed to achieve, accomplished not through force or technique, but through patience, respect, and an understanding that transcended conventional horse-breaking wisdom. The rope remained unused in Jake's hand as he spent long minutes simply standing beside Thunder, his touch gentle and reassuring, his voice continuing its quiet conversation with the magnificent beast. It became clear to the watching crowd that what they were witnessing was not the breaking of a wild horse, but rather the beginning of a partnership between two beings who had found something in each other that transcended the typical relationship between man and animal. Emma Carter felt something shift inside her as she watched Jake work with Thunder. Here was a man who approached impossible challenges not with arrogance or force, but with humility and understanding. His success with Thunder spoke of depths of character that had nothing to do with wealth or social position, qualities that Emma had begun to believe no longer existed in the men of her acquaintance. For the first time since making her challenge, she found herself hoping that this particular suitor would succeed, not for the entertainment value, but because something in Jake Miller's quiet competence appealed to her on a level she was only beginning to understand. The moment Jake placed the rope around Thunder's neck, something extraordinary happened that would be talked about in Copper Creek for generations to come. The magnificent stallion, who had fought every previous attempt at capture with the fury of a mountain storm, simply stood still and accepted the touch of braided rawhide, as if it were a gesture of friendship rather than submission. The crowd gathered around the breaking corral fell into stunned silence, watching in amazement as Jake gently guided Thunder through movements that demonstrated not conquest but cooperation. Emma Carter found her heart racing as she observed this unprecedented display of harmony between man and horse. Jake's method was so different from everything she had witnessed the previous day that it seemed almost magical. Where other men had tried to impose their will through strength and technique, Jake appeared to be inviting Thunder into a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. The stallion's response was equally remarkable, his powerful muscles relaxed and his intelligent eyes focused on Jake with what could only be described as trust. Samuel Carter watched from his position near the ranch house, his experienced cattleman's eye taking in every detail of the interaction between his daughter's latest suitor and the horse that had become legendary throughout the territory. In his 40 years of raising livestock, Samuel had never witnessed anything quite like what was unfolding in his breaking corral. Thunder moved with Jake as if they had been working together for years, responding to subtle cues and gentle guidance, with a willingness that defied everything Samuel thought he knew about horse behavior. The test of Jake's skill came when he prepared to mount Thunder for the first time. This was the moment when every previous challenger had met spectacular failure, when Thunder's wild nature had asserted itself with devastating effectiveness. The crowd held its collective breath as Jake approached Thunder's left side, his movements still unhurried and deliberate, his voice maintaining the same quiet conversation that had begun when he first entered the corral. Thunder's ears remained forward and alert, but there was no tension in his magnificent frame as Jake placed his foot in the stirrup. The stallion stood motionless, his breathing steady and calm, as Jake swung his leg over the broad back that no man had ever successfully mounted. When Jake settled into position, Thunder turned his head slightly to regard his rider with what appeared to be curiosity, rather than the explosive resistance that had characterized his previous encounters with would-be tamers. The ride that followed was unlike anything the assembled witnesses had ever seen. Instead of the violent bucking and spinning that had marked Thunder's previous performances, the stallion moved with smooth, controlled power beneath Jake's guidance. They circled the corral at a steady pace, horse and rider moving together as if they had been partners for years rather than minutes. Jake's posture remained relaxed and confident, his hands gentle on the reins, his voice continuing its quiet encouragement. Old Pete Johnson felt tears forming in his weathered eyes as he watched the display of horsemanship unfolding before him. The sight transported him back to his youth, to those precious few times he had witnessed true masters at work with difficult horses. Jake's achievement went far beyond simple horsebreaking. It represented a form of communication that transcended species barriers, a demonstration of the deep understanding that could exist between humans and animals when respect replaced dominance as the governing principle. Doc Harris, who had positioned himself near the corral fence in anticipation of treating injuries, found himself witnessing something that challenged his understanding of both human and animal psychology. The transformation in Thunder's behavior was so complete, so immediate, that it seemed to suggest the stallion had been waiting for exactly the right person to come along. Someone who could see past his wild exterior to the intelligence and nobility that lay beneath. Mary Thompson clutched her neighbor's arm as Jake guided Thunder through increasingly complex maneuvers around the corral. The stallion responded to the lightest touch of the reins, the gentlest pressure of Jake's legs, as if anticipating his rider's intentions before they were fully formed. This was not the mechanical obedience of a broken horse, but rather the eager cooperation of an animal who had found a human worthy of his respect and trust. Sheriff Tom Wilson observed the proceedings with the analytical eye of a lawman who had learned to read people and situations with exceptional accuracy. There was something about Jake's performance that suggested extensive experience with difficult situations, a level of competence that went far beyond simple horse handling skills. The man's bearing and method spoke of training and knowledge that extended well beyond what might be expected from a drifter seeking odd jobs in a frontier town. Ben Rodriguez, who had provided Jake with temporary employment and shelter, watched with growing amazement as the quiet stranger accomplished what the territory's most skilled horsemen had failed to achieve. Ben had observed Jake's interactions with the horses in his livery stable and had noted an unusual quality in the man's approach to animal handling. But nothing had prepared him for the spectacular demonstration of skill now unfolding before his eyes. The crowd's amazement reached its peak when Jake dismounted Thunder, after completing several circuits of the corral, and immediately remounted without any assistance or restraint of the stallion. Thunder stood perfectly still during both dismounts and mounts, his behavior indicating complete acceptance of Jake's presence and authority. This level of cooperation from the legendary wild horse was so unprecedented that several spectators wondered aloud if they were witnessing some form of supernatural intervention. Emma found herself studying Jake with newfound fascination as he continued working with Thunder. His success with the stallion revealed depths of character and ability that his humble appearance and quiet demeanor had concealed. Here was a man who approached challenges with intelligence and patience rather than brute force, who understood that true strength sometimes lay in gentleness and respect rather than dominance and control. As the morning progressed, Jake's work with Thunder evolved from simple demonstration of the stallion's acceptance to a genuine training session that showcased both his own skills and Thunder's remarkable intelligence. They moved through exercises that tested the horse's willingness to respond to increasingly subtle commands, each successful completion building upon the foundation of trust and communication that Jake had so carefully established. The transformation in Thunder's demeanor was nothing short of miraculous. The stallion, who had spent 3 years running free in the wild country beyond Devil's Canyon, who had never allowed a human to approach within 50 yards, now moved with eager responsiveness to Jake's guidance. His ears remained constantly forward, his attention focused on his rider with an intensity that suggested genuine enjoyment of the partnership they had formed. Samuel Carter found himself reevaluating his assessment of the quiet stranger who had appeared at his ranch the previous evening. Jake's achievement with Thunder was impressive enough on its own merits, but the man's methods revealed a depth of understanding and skill that spoke of extensive experience with difficult situations. This was not the work of a lucky amateur, but rather the performance of someone who possessed genuine expertise in reading and working with challenging animals. The implications of Jake's success began to sink in among the assembled crowd as the morning wore on. Emma Carter had publicly declared that she would consider marriage to any man who could accomplish what 20 skilled horsemen had failed to achieve, and Jake Miller had not only succeeded, but had done so with a style and grace that made the previous attempts appear clumsy and misguided by comparison. Brad Morrison, whose own spectacular failure the previous day had left him nursing both physical and emotional wounds, watched Jake's performance with a mixture of grudging admiration and wounded pride. Morrison had approached Thunder with all the confidence that wealth and social position could provide, certain that his expensive equipment and professional training would be sufficient to master any horse. Jake's success with nothing more than patience, skill, and understanding was a humbling lesson in the difference between artificial advantages and genuine competence. The Garrett brothers, professional horsebreakers whose reputation had been built on successfully taming the most difficult animals on the northern plains, observed Jake's work with the analytical attention of craftsmen studying the master's technique. They recognized the quality of what they were witnessing, even as they struggled to understand how their own carefully developed methods had proven so inadequate against Thunder's wild nature. Colonel William Hayes, the military horse trainer whose systematic approach had been countered by Thunder's intelligence and cunning, found himself forced to acknowledge that some situations required intuition and adaptability rather than rigid adherence to established procedures. Jake's success demonstrated that the most effective approach to complex challenges might be the one that appeared simplest on the surface while being most sophisticated in its understanding of the underlying dynamics involved. As the sun climbed toward its zenith, Jake began demonstrating advanced techniques with Thunder that showcased not only the stallion's acceptance of human partnership but also his remarkable capacity for learning and adaptation. They moved through exercises that tested Thunder's willingness to respond to voice commands, his ability to change pace and direction with minimal guidance, and his comfort with increasingly complex maneuvers that would be essential for practical ranch work. Thunder's performance exceeded even Jake's expectations, the stallion displaying an eagerness to learn and please that had been completely absent during his encounters with previous would-be tamers. Each new challenge was met with alert attention and rapid mastery, as if Thunder had been waiting for exactly the right teacher to unlock his considerable potential for cooperation and partnership with humans. Emma Carter found herself drawn not just to Jake's obvious skill with horses, but to the character qualities that his approach revealed. His success with Thunder demonstrated patience, understanding, and a rare ability to see past surface appearances to underlying potential. These were qualities that Emma had begun to believe were extinct among the men of her acquaintance, characteristics that spoke to the kind of partnership she had always hoped to find in marriage. The crowd that had gathered to witness what many expected would be another failure began to disperse as Jake's success became undeniable. Word of his achievement with Thunder spread quickly through Copper Creek, carried by witnesses who could barely believe what they had seen with their own eyes. By afternoon, the story had grown in the telling, though even the most embellished versions could hardly do justice to the reality of what had transpired in the Carter ranch-breaking corral. Old Pete Johnson lingered after the other spectators had departed, his experienced eye taking in details of Jake's continued work with Thunder that confirmed his growing suspicions about the young man's background. The techniques Jake employed, the subtle ways he communicated with the stallion, the depth of understanding he displayed all spoke of training and experience that went far beyond what might be expected from an ordinary drifter seeking temporary employment. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across Pine Ridge Valley, Jake finally concluded his work with Thunder for the day. The stallion stood calmly as Jake removed the simple rope halter, showing no inclination to flee or resist, despite being free to do so. Instead, Thunder remained close to Jake, his behavior indicating a genuine attachment to the man who had treated him with such unprecedented respect and understanding. Emma Carter approached the corral fence as Jake emerged from his successful session with Thunder. For the first time since making her public challenge, she found herself genuinely curious about one of her potential suitors rather than simply amused by their inevitable failure. Jake's achievement with Thunder had revealed qualities that went far beyond simple horse handling skills, characteristics that suggested depths of character worthy of serious consideration. Samuel Carter joined his daughter at the fence, his businessman's instincts warring with his parental protectiveness as he studied the quiet stranger who had accomplished the impossible. Jake's success with Thunder was undeniable, but the man himself remained an enigma. His clothes and manner marked him as a working man with limited resources, yet his skills suggested training and experience that were anything but common. The conversation that followed would prove to be as significant as Jake's demonstration with Thunder, for it was during this first real exchange between Emma and Jake that the foundations were laid for a relationship that would transcend the original challenge and grow into something neither had expected when the morning began. Emma's questions about Jake's background and experience were met with careful answers that revealed just enough to maintain her interest, while preserving the mystery that surrounded his past. Jake's responses to Emma's inquiries demonstrated the same thoughtful intelligence that had characterized his approach to Thunder. He spoke with quiet confidence about his love for horses and his belief that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect rather than dominance, principles that Emma recognized could apply to human relationships as well as equine training. His words revealed a philosophical depth that seemed inconsistent with his humble appearance and temporary employment status. As evening approached and the day's remarkable events began to settle into memory, it became clear that Jake Miller's success with Thunder had initiated changes that would ripple far beyond the simple completion of Emma Carter's challenge. Quiet Stranger had not only tamed an untamable horse, but had also begun to capture the interest and imagination of a woman who had begun to believe that worthy men no longer existed in her world. News of Jake Miller's extraordinary achievement with Thunder spread across the Colorado Territory like wildfire in dry grass. Within days, writers carried the story to distant ranches and mining camps, each telling growing more elaborate with distance and repetition. Some claimed Jake had whispered ancient Indian magic to calm the wild stallion. Others insisted he possessed supernatural powers inherited from mysterious bloodlines. The truth, as often happens with frontier legends, became less important than the story itself. But not everyone who heard the tale was impressed by Jake's success. In the exclusive Gentlemen's Club of Denver, where territorial politicians and wealthy businessmen gathered to discuss matters of commerce and influence, the story of a poor drifter winning Emma Carter's challenge was received with skepticism and concern. Vincent Hawthorne, owner of the largest horse trading operation between Kansas City and San Francisco, listened to the account with growing irritation. Hawthorne was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the strategic application of wealth and influence. He had been monitoring the situation at Sunset Valley Ranch with considerable interest, seeing Emma Carter not just as a beautiful woman, but as the key to acquiring Samuel Carter's extensive horse breeding operation. The prospect of a nobody disrupting his carefully laid plans was both infuriating and unacceptable. Vincent's response was swift and decisive. Within a week of hearing about Jake's success, he had assembled a team of the finest horsemen money could hire. These were not the individual cowboys who had failed at Emma's original challenge, but rather a coordinated group of professionals who specialized in handling difficult animals for wealthy clients across the frontier. Led by Marcus Stone, a former cavalry officer who had trained horses for the Union Army, this team brought both sophisticated equipment and proven techniques refined through years of successful operations. The arrival of Hawthorne's expedition in Copper Creek created a sensation that overshadowed even the excitement generated by Jake's initial triumph. Marcus Stone and his 5 companions rode into town with military precision, their matching gear and coordinated movements marking them as something different from the usual collection of individual challengers. They established themselves at the Silver Dollar Saloon, where Stone announced that Vincent Hawthorne was prepared to offer Emma Carter a proper demonstration of professional horse training techniques. Stone's challenge was carefully crafted to undermine Jake's achievement while positioning Hawthorne as Emma's most suitable suitor. He suggested that Jake's success with Thunder had been a fortunate accident, the result of the stallion being worn down by previous attempts rather than any particular skill on the poor cowboy's part. A truly wild horse, Stone argued, would require the coordinated efforts of trained professionals using proven methods, developed through scientific study of animal behavior. To prove his point, Stone proposed a new challenge. His team would capture and break not just one wild horse, but an entire herd that roamed the remote reaches of Devil's Canyon, animals that had never been approached by humans and retained all their natural wildness and cunning. Furthermore, they would accomplish this feat within a week, demonstrating the efficiency and reliability of professional methods compared to the time-consuming approach Jake had used with Thunder. Emma Carter received Stone's proposal with the same cool composure she had shown during the original challenge, but those who knew her well could see the spark of anger in her eyes. The implication that Jake's achievement had been somehow fraudulent or accidental struck her as both unfair and insulting. She had witnessed Jake's work with Thunder firsthand and recognized the genuine skill and understanding that his approach had demonstrated. Samuel Carter's reaction to Stone's challenge was more complex. As a businessman, he could appreciate Vincent Hawthorne's wealth and connections, qualities that would bring substantial advantages to any marriage alliance. Hawthorne's horse trading empire represented exactly the kind of expansion opportunity that could transform Sunset Valley Ranch from a regional operation into a territorial powerhouse. Yet Samuel had also observed Jerv's remarkable work with Thunder and recognized that the young man possessed abilities that could not be easily dismissed or explained away. Jake himself received news of the new challenge with characteristic quiet contemplation. He had been working with Thunder daily since their initial breakthrough, refining their partnership and exploring the depths of the stallion's intelligence and capability. The bond between man and horse had grown stronger with each passing day, creating a connection that transcended the simple relationship between rider and mount. Old Pete Johnson sought Jake out at Rodriguez's livery stable, where the young man continued to earn his keep while spending most of his free time with Thunder. Pete's weathered face bore an expression of concern as he settled onto a hay bale beside Jake, who was methodically cleaning and oiling a saddle with the careful attention to detail that marked all his activities. The conversation that followed revealed more about Jake's background than he had shared with anyone since arriving in Copper Creek. Pete's gentle questioning, backed by decades of experience reading men and their secrets, gradually drew out details of Jake's past that explained much about his extraordinary abilities with horses. Jake had learned his techniques not from books or formal training, but from years of working with a Lakota horsemaster who had taken the young white boy under his wing after a devastating family tragedy. The story that emerged was one of loss, learning, and gradual healing. Jake's family had been killed in a Cheyenne raid when he was barely 15, leaving him alone and adrift on the frontier, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a deep hatred for the world that had taken everything he loved. He had been found by Standing Bear, an elderly Lakota warrior who recognized something in the boy's anguish that reminded him of his own losses during the Indian Wars. Standing Bear had taken Jake into his band, not as a captive but as his son, teaching him the ancient ways of understanding horses that had been passed down through generations of Plains Indians. The training had taken years, requiring Jake to learn not just techniques, but an entirely different way of thinking about the relationship between humans and animals. He had been taught to see horses as partners and teachers rather than property, to be dominated, to listen with his heart as well as his eyes and ears. The death of Standing Bear 3 years earlier had left Jake once again alone in the world, carrying knowledge and skills that few white men possessed, but uncertain how to use them in a society that valued conquest over cooperation. He had wandered from place to place, taking odd jobs and avoiding attention, until the story of Thunder and Emma's challenge had drawn him to Copper Creek like a moth to flame. Pete listened to Jake's story with the understanding of a man who had seen enough of life to recognize truth when he heard it. The old horse trainer's suspicions about Jake's background had been confirmed, but the reality was even more remarkable than he had imagined. Jake's abilities were not the result of luck or accident, but rather the product of training and techniques that few white men had ever been privileged to learn. As word of the new challenge spread through Copper Creek, the town began to divide into factions supporting either Jake or Stone's professional team. Many of the businessmen and more prosperous citizens saw advantages in Vincent Hawthorne's wealth and connections, viewing an alliance with his organization as beneficial for the entire community. Others, particularly the working men who had observed Jake's character during his brief time in town, found themselves drawn to support the quiet stranger who had accomplished the impossible through skill and understanding rather than money and influence. Mary Thompson found herself firmly in Jake's camp, having observed his courteous behavior and genuine humility during his visits to her general store. She organized the women of Copper Creek in support of what she termed true love over mere convenience, arguing that Emma Carter deserved a husband who valued her for herself rather than her father's ranch and horses. Doc Harris took a more analytical approach to the situation, recognizing that the upcoming challenge would test not just competing horse training methods but also different philosophies about the relationship between humans and animals. Stone's team represented the systematic, scientific approach that was becoming increasingly popular in Eastern agricultural circles, while Jake embodied a more intuitive method that relied on deep understanding and mutual respect. Sheriff Tom Wilson observed the growing tension in Copper Creek with the concern of a lawman who understood how quickly disputes could escalate into violence on the frontier. Vincent Hawthorne's wealth and influence gave him resources that could be used to intimidate or corrupt, while Jake's supporters included men who were accustomed to settling disagreements with direct action rather than legal proceedings. Week leading up to Stone's attempt to capture and break the Devils Canyon herd was filled with preparation and anticipation that reached levels not seen in Copper Creek since the Gold Rush days. Stone's team established an elaborate camp outside town, complete with specialized equipment shipped from Denver and detailed maps of the canyon country where the wild horses roamed. Jake's preparations were characteristically simple and quiet. He spent long hours with Thunder, not training for any specific challenge, but simply deepening their partnership and understanding. Those who observed these sessions noted that the bond between man and horse continued to evolve, reaching levels of communication and cooperation that seemed almost supernatural to witnesses unfamiliar with such deep connections. Emma Carter found herself torn between fascination with the approaching contest and concern for Jake's welfare. Stone's team brought not just superior numbers and equipment, but also a ruthless efficiency that suggested they were prepared to use whatever methods proved necessary to achieve their goals. The wild horses of Devil's Canyon had never been hunted by such organized and well-equipped professionals, but neither had Jake ever faced competitors who combined genuine skill with the backing of unlimited resources. Samuel Carter spent the week evaluating both sides of the upcoming challenge, his businessman's instincts warring with his growing respect for Jake's character and abilities. Vincent Hawthorne's marriage proposal, delivered through Stone with elaborate formality, offered advantages that could transform Sunset Valley Ranch into a territorial empire. The proposed merger would combine Samuel's breeding expertise with Hawthorne's marketing network, creating opportunities for expansion that Samuel had only dreamed of achieving. Yet Samuel had also observed Jake's daily work with Thunder and recognized qualities in the young man that transcended mere horse handling skills. Jake's approach to challenges demonstrated patience, intelligence, and an understanding of complex situations that suggested he might be capable of far more than his humble circumstances indicated. The question that haunted Samuel was whether Jake's potential could be developed into the kind of practical success that Emma would need in a husband. The evening before Stone's challenge, Jake made an unexpected visit to the Carter Ranch. He found Emma on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, her expression thoughtful as she contemplated the decision that awaited her, regardless of the next day's outcome. Their conversation that evening would prove to be pivotal in the development of their relationship, for it was then that Jake revealed more of his philosophy about horses, challenges, and life itself. He spoke of the lessons Standing Bear had taught him about seeing beneath surface appearances to understand the true nature of things, about the importance of building relationships based on mutual respect rather than dominance or control. Emma found herself drawn not just to Jake's words, but to the quiet confidence and genuine wisdom they revealed. Here was a man who had faced genuine hardship and loss, yet emerged with his capacity for compassion and understanding intact. His approach to thunder had demonstrated that strength could be expressed through gentleness, that true mastery came from partnership rather than conquest. As they talked through the evening hours, Emma began to understand that Jake's challenge to Stone's team represented more than just a contest of horse training methods. It was a fundamental clash between different ways of approaching life's difficulties, between the philosophy that problems could be solved through the application of superior resources, and the belief that understanding and cooperation offered better solutions than force and domination. The night passed slowly for both Jake and Emma, each recognizing that the morning would bring changes that would affect not just their own futures but the entire community of Copper Creek. Stone's challenge had transformed what began as a simple contest into something larger, a test of values and approaches that would determine the direction of Emma's life and the nature of the partnership she would ultimately choose. As dawn approached over Pine Ridge Valley, Jake prepared to face the most significant challenge of his life, not just as a horseman, but as a man seeking to prove that character and understanding were more valuable than wealth and conventional advantage. The wild horses of Devil's Canyon awaited, and with them the answer to questions that had been building since the moment Jake first laid eyes on Thunder and recognized a kindred spirit yearning for the right kind of partnership. The morning of the Devil's Canyon expedition dawned with an ominous stillness that seemed to hang over Pine Ridge Valley like a held breath. Storm clouds gathered around the mountain peaks, their dark masses promising the kind of weather that could turn a challenging horse capture into a life-threatening ordeal. Marcus Stone surveyed the threatening sky with the calculating eye of a military commander, his weathered face showing no concern for the approaching tempest. Stone's team had spent the week preparing for this moment with meticulous attention to detail. Their camp resembled a military operation more than a simple horse hunting expedition, complete with detailed maps, coordinated timing schedules, and specialized equipment designed for capturing multiple animals simultaneously. Each of the 5 men under Stone's command had been chosen for specific skills, creating a balanced unit capable of handling any situation they might encounter in the treacherous terrain of Devil's Canyon. Jake Miller stood quietly beside Thunder at the edge of Copper Creek, watching Stone's elaborate preparations with the serene composure that had marked all his actions since arriving in the territory. While Stone's team loaded wagons with ropes, nets, tranquilizer equipment, and provisions for an extended campaign, Jake carried only his simple rope, a canteen of water, and the unshakable confidence that came from years of learning to work with rather than against the natural world. The contrast between the two approaches could not have been more stark. Stone's expedition represented the triumph of organization and technology over natural obstacles, the systematic application of proven methods refined through countless successful operations. Jake embodied a different philosophy entirely, one that relied on understanding, patience, and the kind of intuitive connection with animals that could not be taught from textbooks or military manuals. Emma Carter watched the preparations from her father's porch, her heart heavy with concern for Jake's safety and uncertainty about her own future. The arrival of Vincent Hawthorne himself the previous evening had added new complexity to an already difficult situation. Hawthorne was everything that frontier society considered desirable in a prospective husband. Wealthy, sophisticated, connected to powerful interests throughout the territory, and blessed with the kind of polished charm that opened doors in the highest social circles. Hawthorne's proposal had been presented with all the ceremony and formality that Emma's social position demanded. He spoke eloquently of his admiration for her beauty and intelligence, of the advantages their union would bring to both families, of the exciting opportunities that awaited them in the expanding markets of the territorial economy. His vision was compelling, promising Emma a life of comfort and influence far beyond what she could expect in the isolation of Pine Ridge Valley. Yet something in Hawthorne's manner left Emma feeling more like a business acquisition than a cherished partner. His compliments, while flowery and appropriate, seemed calculated to achieve specific effects rather than arising from genuine emotion. His plans for their future focused heavily on the practical advantages of combining their family resources while saying little about the personal happiness or emotional fulfillment that Emma had always hoped to find in marriage. Samuel Carter found himself genuinely torn between the two suitors competing for his daughter's hand. Hawthorne's wealth and connections offered everything a practical father could desire for his child's security and advancement. The horse trading empire that would result from their marriage would create opportunities for expansion and influence that Samuel had never dared imagine possible. Jake Miller represented entirely different possibilities, ones that were harder to quantify but no less significant. The young man's extraordinary skill with horses had been demonstrated beyond any doubt, but his potential extended far beyond simple animal handling. Samuel had observed Jake's character during the week since Thunder's taming, noting qualities of integrity, intelligence, and quiet leadership that suggested capabilities for growth and achievement that had nothing to do with inherited wealth or social connections. The citizens of Copper Creek had divided into passionate factions supporting either Jake or Hawthorne's cause. The division cut across normal social boundaries in unexpected ways, with some of the town's most prominent citizens backing the poor cowboy, while certain working men found themselves impressed by Hawthorne's promises of economic development and increased prosperity for the entire community. Mary Thompson had become Jake's most vocal champion among the town's women, organizing support with the same energy she brought to church socials and community improvement projects. She argued passionately that Emma deserved a husband who valued her for herself rather than her father's assets, someone who would treat her as a beloved partner rather than a strategic acquisition. Doc Harris took a more philosophical view of the situation, recognizing that the competition between Jake and Hawthorne represented different visions of what the American frontier could become. Hawthorne embodied the forces of industrial organization and capital investment that were transforming the West from a wilderness into an extension of Eastern commercial civilization. Jake represented older values, the possibility that progress could be achieved through understanding and cooperation, rather than domination and exploitation. Sheriff Tom Wilson had spent the week managing increasing tensions between the rival factions. His diplomatic skills stretched to their limits as arguments in the Silver Dollar Saloon grew more heated and longtime friends found themselves on opposite sides of passionate disagreements. Wilson understood that the outcome of the horse capture challenge could have consequences extending far beyond Emma Carter's choice of husband. Ben Rodriguez had offered to accompany Jake on his expedition into Devil's Canyon, but Jake had politely declined the assistance. His reasons, he explained, had nothing to do with pride or false confidence, but rather with the nature of the task he faced. The wild horses of Devil's Canyon had learned to fear human presence through generations of avoiding capture attempts. A single rider moving with patience and respect might succeed where a larger group would certainly fail. Old Pete Johnson had shared his own concerns about Jake's plan during their final conversation before the expedition began. Pete's knowledge of Devil's Canyon extended back 40 years, and he understood better than most the dangers that awaited anyone venturing into that remote and treacherous country. The terrain was difficult enough under ideal conditions, but the approaching storm would create hazards that could prove fatal to even experienced riders. Jake listened to Pete's warnings with respectful attention, but his decision remained unchanged. Standing Bear had taught him that some challenges could only be met alone, that certain kinds of understanding required solitude and complete focus on the task at hand. The wild horses of Devil's Canyon had never been successfully captured because previous attempts had relied on overwhelming force rather than patient observation and careful planning. The contrast between Jake's solitary preparation and Stone's elaborate military operation created a spectacle that drew observers from ranches and mining camps throughout the region. Word of the challenge had spread far beyond Copper Creek, transforming what had begun as a local contest into an event of territorial significance. Stone's departure from Copper Creek resembled a parade more than a hunting expedition. His team rode in formation, their matching equipment and coordinated movements, impressive to observers who valued displays of professional competence and systematic organization. The wagons that followed carried enough supplies and specialized gear to support an extended campaign against any number of wild horses. Jake's departure, 15 minutes later, created no spectacle whatsoever. He simply mounted Thunder and rode quietly out of town, his direction taking him toward the high country trails that led to Devil's Canyon by a more direct, but far more difficult route than the one Stone's expedition had chosen. Those who witnessed his departure noted the remarkable partnership that had developed between Jake and Thunder, the stallion moving with eager anticipation as if understanding the significance of their mission. Emma Carter found herself unable to concentrate on normal activities as the day progressed. She tried to occupy herself with household tasks and correspondence, but her thoughts kept returning to Jake's quiet confidence and the dangers that awaited him in the remote canyon country. Vincent Hawthorne's presence at the ranch, while socially appropriate and carefully respectful, only added to her emotional turmoil. Hawthorne was everything that conventional wisdom declared she should want in a husband. His conversation was sophisticated and entertaining, his manners impeccable, his plans for their future both practical and ambitious. Yet Emma found herself comparing his polished charm unfavorably to Jake's quiet sincerity, his calculated compliments to Jake's genuine respect and understanding. The afternoon brought the first drops of rain, scattered droplets that promised the full fury of a mountain storm before evening. Samuel Carter watched the darkening sky with growing concern, understanding that the weather would transform an already dangerous situation into something potentially catastrophic. Devil's Canyon was treacherous enough under ideal conditions, but rain would make the narrow trails slippery and the rocky terrain nearly impassable. Stone's expedition had established their base camp at the mouth of Devil's Canyon, where the narrow entrance provided natural barriers that could be used to trap wild horses attempting to escape. Their strategy relied on systematic coordination, with teams positioned at strategic points throughout the canyon to drive the horses toward prepared capture sites equipped with nets and tranquilizer equipment. The plan was methodical and thorough, accounting for every variable that Stone's experience could anticipate. His men were positioned to cover all possible escape routes, their equipment tested and ready, their timing coordinated to ensure maximum efficiency. Stone himself commanded from a central position that allowed him to observe the entire operation and make adjustments as circumstances required. Jake's approach to the same challenge was fundamentally different in every respect. Instead of trying to trap and overwhelm the wild horses, he sought first to understand their patterns and habits, to learn how they moved through their territory and what motivated their behavior. Thunder's presence gave him advantages that no amount of equipment could provide, for the wild horses would recognize the stallion as one of their own kind rather than a tool of human domination. The wild herd of Devil's Canyon consisted of 12 horses led by a magnificent mare whose intelligence and wariness had kept her band free for over a decade. She had learned to recognize the signs of human pursuit and had developed strategies for avoiding capture that had frustrated every previous attempt to take her horses. Her leadership was absolute, her judgment trusted by every member of the herd. Stone's initial movements into the canyon went according to plan, his teams advancing with military precision to establish control over key positions. The wild horses, alerted by the coordinated human activity, began moving toward what Stone's maps indicated should be their primary escape route. Everything was proceeding exactly as the professional horse hunter had anticipated. But the lead mare's experience extended beyond what Stone's research had revealed. She had learned to recognize not just the presence of human hunters, but the patterns of their thinking, the assumptions that guided their strategies. Instead of following the obvious escape route that Stone had so carefully prepared to block, she led her herd in an entirely unexpected direction, using terrain features that did not appear on any of Stone's detailed maps. The first indication Stone received that his carefully laid plans were going awry came when his forward observers reported that the wild horses had simply vanished. Teams positioned to intercept the herd at predicted locations waited in vain. As rain began falling with increasing intensity, turning the rocky canyon floor into a treacherous maze of slippery surfaces and hidden dangers, Jake's position high on the canyon rim gave him a different perspective on the unfolding situation. He watched Stone's team struggle to reposition themselves as their systematic plan collapsed in the face of the lead mare's superior knowledge of her own territory. The professional horse hunters were discovering that all their preparation and equipment meant nothing if they could not locate their quarry. Thunder's behavior confirmed what Jake was beginning to understand about the wild horse's strategy. The stallion's ears were constantly in motion, tracking sounds that Jake's human senses could not detect, following the movement of the herd through terrain that appeared impossible to navigate. The wild horses were not simply fleeing from Stone's expedition, but rather leading it into increasingly difficult country, where superior equipment would become more liability than advantage. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke with full mountain fury, just as Stone realized that his expedition was in serious trouble. Rain turned to sleet and then to snow as the temperature dropped rapidly, creating conditions that made travel dangerous and visibility nearly impossible. The elaborate communication system that Stone had established between his teams became useless as weather conditions prevented reliable contact between widely separated positions. Jake found himself facing an entirely different kind of challenge than he had anticipated. The wild horses were no longer simply avoiding human pursuit, but were actively using the storm to their advantage, moving through terrain that would be familiar to them even in complete darkness. His success would depend not on capturing them, despite the weather, but on understanding how to work with the natural conditions rather than fighting against them. The lead mare's strategy became clear as Jake observed her herd's movements through the driving snow. She was not simply trying to escape from the canyon, but was instead leading Stone's expedition deeper into country where their superior numbers and equipment would become disadvantages rather than assets. The professional horse hunters were being systematically outmaneuvered by an opponent whose intelligence they had seriously underestimated. As night fell over Devil's Canyon, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just different approaches to horse capture, but fundamentally different philosophies about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Stone's expedition found themselves trapped by weather and terrain in a situation their training had not prepared them to handle, while Jake faced the greatest challenge of his life, armed with nothing but understanding, patience, and the partnership of a horse who had chosen to trust him completely. The blizzard that engulfed Devil's Canyon transformed the landscape into an alien world of howling wind and blinding snow. Marcus Stone's carefully orchestrated expedition found themselves fighting for survival rather than pursuing wild horses. Their sophisticated equipment becoming burdens in the face of nature's overwhelming fury. 3 of Stone's men had already suffered injuries from falls on the treacherous ice-covered rocks, and their coordinated strategy had devolved into a desperate search for shelter. Jake Miller moved through the storm with Thunder as if they were part of the tempest itself, the stallion's sure footing and keen senses guiding them along paths that seemed invisible to human eyes. The technique Standing Bear had taught him years ago came flooding back. Lessons about reading the subtle signs that revealed safe passage through hostile terrain, about trusting the instincts of animals who understood their environment better than any human planning could achieve. The wild horses had vanished into the storm like spirits, but Jake knew they had not fled the canyon. The lead mare was too intelligent to abandon territory she knew intimately for the uncertain dangers of unfamiliar country. Instead, she had led her herd to shelter, waiting for the humans to exhaust themselves fighting conditions they could not control or understand. Thunder's behavior confirmed Jake's intuition, the stallion's head turning toward a section of canyon wall that appeared solid, but concealed passages known only to the animals who had lived here for generations. Jake dismounted and approached. On foot, feeling along the rock face until he discovered the narrow opening that led to a network of caves where the wild horses had taken refuge. The moment Jake stepped into the cave system, he entered a different world entirely. The howling wind faded to a whisper, replaced by the soft sounds of horses moving in darkness, their breathing and gentle nickering creating a symphony of life sheltered from the storm's violence. Jake's eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light, filtering from hidden openings in the rock, revealing spaces large enough to accommodate the entire wild herd. The lead mare stood at the center of her band, her intelligent eyes fixed on Jake with an alertness that held no fear, only careful evaluation. She had seen many humans attempt to capture her horses, but none had ever approached with the respectful patience that Jake demonstrated. He moved slowly through the cave, speaking in the same quiet tones he had used with Thunder, acknowledging the mare's authority over her domain. What followed was not a capture in any conventional sense, but rather a conversation conducted in the ancient language of mutual respect between species. Jake offered no ropes or restraints, made no aggressive moves toward the horses, instead simply sharing their shelter and waiting for them to decide whether he represented threat or opportunity. Meanwhile, Stone's expedition was discovering the deadly consequences of underestimating both the weather and their quarry. 2 of his men were trapped on a narrow ledge, unable to advance or retreat in the face of the storm's fury. Their sophisticated communication equipment had failed completely, leaving Stone unable to coordinate rescue efforts or even maintain contact with his scattered teams. Vincent Hawthorne, monitoring the situation from the comfort of the Carter Ranch, began to realize that his carefully planned demonstration of professional superiority was turning into a disaster that could destroy his reputation throughout the territory. The reports filtering back from Devil's Canyon spoke of injuries, equipment failures, and complete collapse of Stone's systematic approach to horse capture. Emma Carter paced the ranch house floors, her concern for Jake's safety growing. With each passing hour, the storm had exceeded even the worst predictions of local weather experts, creating conditions that would challenge the survival skills of the most experienced mountain men. Her father's attempts to reassure her rang hollow when they both understood the deadly nature of the forces Jake faced alone in the high country. As the storm raged through the night, Jake's patience began to yield unexpected results. The wild horses, recognizing that he posed no immediate threat, gradually relaxed their vigilance. The younger animals, driven by curiosity, approached closer to examine this strange human who moved among them without aggression or demand for submission. Thunder played a crucial role in this delicate process, his presence serving as a bridge between Jake's human world and the wild horse's natural existence. The stallion's acceptance of Jake spoke more powerfully than any words could have managed, demonstrating that partnership between human and horse was possible without the loss of dignity or freedom that the wild animals had learned to associate with human contact. The lead mare's decision came just before dawn, when the storm finally began to exhaust its fury and the first gray light of morning filtered into the cave system. She approached Jake directly, her movements deliberate and purposeful, stopping just within reach of his outstretched hand. The touch that followed was brief but profound, a moment of connection that acknowledged Jake as worthy of trust. What happened next would be talked about in Copper Creek for generations to come. Instead of trying to drive the wild horses toward capture, Jake simply walked out of the cave system with Thunder, moving slowly toward the canyon entrance. The wild herd followed, not as captives being led to confinement, but as partners choosing to explore new possibilities. Stone's rescue teams found the professional horse hunter and his men scattered throughout the canyon, some injured, all exhausted and demoralized by their encounter with forces they had been powerless to control. Their expensive equipment lay abandoned or broken, their systematic approach to horse capture revealed as inadequate when faced with the complexity of nature's challenges. The sight that greeted the people of Copper Creek as Jake emerged from Devil's Canyon defied every expectation. He rode Thunder at the head of a procession that included not just the entire wild herd, but also Stone's expedition, their wounded members helped by Jake's ministrations and their spirits, lifted by his quiet leadership during the final stages of their ordeal. The wild horses moved freely around Jake and Thunder, showing none of the fearful behavior that typically characterized recently captured animals. Instead, they displayed the calm alertness of creatures who had made their own choice to explore new relationships with humans, their trust earned rather than forced through superior strength or equipment. Emma Carter met the procession at the edge of town, her relief at seeing Jake safe overwhelming every other consideration. The sight of him leading the wild horses with such natural authority, while also ensuring the safety of Stone's injured men, revealed depths of character that transcended anything she had imagined possible. Vincent Hawthorne's reaction to Jake's triumph was swift and decisive. Recognizing that his own position had become untenable, he withdrew his marriage proposal with as much dignity as circumstances allowed, citing pressing business obligations that required his immediate attention. Elsewhere, his departure from Copper Creek was as elaborate as his arrival had been, but the confident assumption of success that had marked his earlier presence was notably absent. Samuel Carter found himself reevaluating everything he thought he understood about success, leadership, and the qualities that mattered most in choosing a son-in-law. Jake's achievement went far beyond simple horse handling, demonstrating problem-solving abilities, courage under pressure, and leadership qualities that could not be purchased or inherited, but had to be earned through character and experience. The integration of the wild horses into the life of Sunset Valley Ranch proceeded with the same patient respect that had characterized Jake's initial approach to Thunder. Instead of being broken to saddle and bridle, the horses were invited to discover the benefits of partnership with humans while retaining their essential dignity and freedom of choice. Emma's decision regarding Jake's marriage proposal was made not through dramatic declaration, but through the quiet certainty that had grown during the week since Thunder's first taming. She recognized in Jake the partner she had always hoped to find, someone who approached challenges with intelligence and patience, who valued cooperation over domination, and who possessed the strength to remain gentle even when facing overwhelming odds. Their wedding took place 6 months later, a celebration that brought together not just the people of Copper Creek, but visitors from throughout the territory, who had heard the story of the poor cowboy who succeeded where 20 skilled horsemen had failed. The ceremony was held outdoors, with Thunder and the other horses serving as honored witnesses to the union between two people who had found in each other the partnership they both had been seeking. The success of their marriage partnership extended far beyond personal happiness. Jake's approach to horse training revolutionized the operation of Sunset Valley Ranch, creating methods that produced better results with less stress on both animals and handlers. The ranch became famous throughout the West for horses trained through cooperation rather than force, animals that displayed the kind of intelligence and willing partnership that could only be achieved through respect and understanding. Years later, when visitors asked Jake about the secret of his success with difficult horses, his answer was always the same. Standing Bear had taught him that the most important tool in working with animals was not strength or equipment, but rather the ability to listen with both heart and mind, to understand that true partnership required seeing the world through another's eyes and finding ways to achieve mutual benefit rather than simple dominance. Emma's role in their partnership extended far beyond the traditional expectations of a rancher's wife. Her natural intelligence and keen eye for horses complemented Jake's intuitive understanding, creating a team whose combined abilities far exceeded what either could have achieved alone. Together, they transformed Sunset Valley Ranch into one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the American West. The story of Jake Miller and Thunder became legend throughout the territories, but those who knew them personally understood that the real magic lay not in any supernatural abilities but in the simple power of approaching challenges with patience, respect, and genuine understanding. Their success proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not to those with the most resources or the most sophisticated methods, but to those who possess the wisdom to work with rather than against the natural order of things. Thunder lived to a great age, spending his final years as the patriarch of the Sunset Valley herd, teaching younger horses the lessons he had learned about the possibility of genuine partnership between humans and animals. His offspring carried forward not just his physical strength and beauty, but also his capacity for the kind of trust and cooperation that transformed work into partnership and competition into collaboration. The principles Jake learned from Standing Bear and demonstrated through his work with Thunder continued to influence horse training methods long after his own time had passed. Visitors to Sunset Valley Ranch carried his techniques to other parts of the frontier, spreading an approach to animal partnership that emphasized understanding over force, and proved that the most lasting victories were those achieved through respect rather than domination. Emma and Jake's children grew up surrounded by horses who demonstrated daily that cooperation produced better results than compulsion, lessons that shaped their approach to all of life's challenges. The values their parents had discovered through their work with Thunder became the foundation for a family legacy that emphasized the importance of patience, understanding, and the courage to approach problems from unexpected directions. The wild horses of Devil's Canyon continued to roam free, but their relationship with the human community of Copper Creek had been forever changed by Jake's demonstration that partnership was possible without the loss of essential dignity or freedom. Future generations of both horses and humans would benefit from the understanding that true strength sometimes lay in gentleness, and that the greatest achievements often belong to those who had the wisdom to listen before acting. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.